All right, so let's get started. So, Paul, clinical integration, all right? You see how far away he sat from me because he knew the first question was coming. So, in the startup space, especially in digital health, everybody likes to talk about how we have, we're heading towards this electronic revolution. Everyone wants to talk about EMRs, and every startup says, well, as soon as I can integrate into an EMR, all of my problems will be solved. As you guys have moved and gained traction in the space, it's really interesting about how you want to work with the startup community in terms of clinical integration, because you've got almost a two-sided marketplace for people that want to work with you and people that you want to integrate into. What does that look like for you?
Right, so I'm Paul Willard. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Practice Fusion. We're a free web-based electronic health record with over 160,000 healthcare providers and over 40 million patients, give or take. So big platform, as Jeff pointed out, and I'd say we're getting to the point where we have critical mass around numbers to start thinking about doing things like this. The first thing is we have to balance. This is an historic time for EHR adoption. It's the steepest that it's ever been. It's probably the steepest that it's ever going to be. And that's going to be true for 2012 and probably 2013 as well. And then it might start to nose over, but it'll still be pretty steep. And so we need to balance market share, because everything in a free model and a network model works better when you have more market share against activities like these that we're dying to do. Yeah. But that said, we're dying to do it because we're a mission-driven company. We want to empower doctors to save lives. If we put up the walled garden and say we're going to do it all by ourselves, we're doing a disservice to our mission. We cannot accomplish that mission on our own. Or if we did, it would take a ridiculous amount of time. So we're better off opening up the network, and we know this. The first place that we've already opened up was actually labs. So we've already opened up an API that labs can come into, sign up for, automated. We've got standards, we've got standard contracts, standard everything. And in the first month that we had that open, we had almost 100 labs come in and sign up to get full connection and full integration with all of our doctors. That's both for lab ordering as well as lab results going back to the doctors. The next one in the roadmap will be a more broad API so that consumer data can go directly into the charts. We're not committed on schedule on that yet, but I'll say it's on the roadmap, and it's not too terribly far away, I don't think. And in fact, we're collecting names of interested people. So go to the Contact Us page on our website to business opportunities, sign up, just tell them you want to know when the API is out because you want to use it, and go get them. But those will be the first two. We have more in our heads, too. We want to open it wide up.
That's fantastic. So 5 minutes into the panel, and you've already got a product announcement from Practice Fusion. That's fantastic. So I already told you were the groundbreakers. I told you this was going to be the best one. So for the rest of you guys, and Eric, I especially want to kind of start with you on this one. You've got this really innovative product, which I'll let you talk about. When you look at clinical integration and how that works with the system versus maybe driving towards a consumer direction, and you hear some of the things that Paul talks about, how do you look at clinical intervention, especially when you might have the tease of a consumer market out there?
Yeah. So I'm Eric Douglas. I'm a co-founder and CEO of CellScope, and we make things like this. So it's hardware and software, basically systems to do diagnostic imaging on a smartphone platform. So we're trying to take things like an otoscope, a dermoscope, common reason people go to the doctor, but these visits that don't really require a visit, things that can be done remotely, things that can be done from home with additional data. And we're trying to enable that connection between the at-home patient and the doctor, or in other non-traditional care settings, the school nurse or camp or whatever, be able to access care from anywhere by sending the doctor the relevant data to be able to make that diagnosis. For us, in thinking about clinical integration and balancing it with targeting the consumers directly, I think we've started out by talking to a lot of doctors, by trying to understand how doctors would want to use it, and I think for us the biggest question was really clinical integration isn't one thing. It's not like we can come up with a model for clinical integration and it's going to work in every clinic. We pretty rapidly discovered that every clinic's different, and different practice models and different structures of how they get paid and how they operate their practice is going to require very different models in how they use technology like ours. And so we've been primarily going to the doctors and asking them their basically how they would want to use it. Not trying to come up with a model a priori and force that on them, but take our devices to them, talk with them about what value they would see in it, and understand how they would fit those data and that information into their practice. I think on the consumer side, it's understanding what their demand is, where the actual pain points are. Do they want to do this sort of thing from home? Do they would they feel comfortable in sending information to the doctor to be able to make the diagnosis? And it's kind of a two-sided thing. Like they all think it's a good idea. People want to have access to this, especially in the case of so ear infection is one of the things we're doing a lot of work on. We've got an attachment for the phone that turns it into an otoscope, and in that case, the doctor and the mom and dad, everybody kind of knows it's an ear infection. A lot of people have high frequency infections, and they kind of know what's going on, and so the doctor wants to see the information, wants to have enough data to make the diagnosis, but needs to be able to actually see it to feel comfortable making a prescription. And so that's what we're enabling is having that connection.
Very cool. And I certainly would encourage anybody that has not seen the CellScope devices. I'll get you in a second, Paula, I promise. And I thank you for the cue. That was cool, outstanding. So the violent pointing towards, I was like, is someone on fire? What's going on? Make sure to take a couple seconds and get a demo from Eric. I mean, it's an extremely cool device, and getting something in your hand it's pretty amazing. So, Paul, jump in there, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been in the EMR space for 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I love the fact that we talk about doctors wanting to see patient-collected data. With all due respect, I make the products to do that today, and all of my customers say that when the data comes into their clinical record, they're liable to have taken note of it and acted on it.
Mm-hmm.
So all your flaky writing, blood pressure monitoring, they don't want it. Actually. So I make the conventional systems, and doctors really don't want that data.
Let me repeat the question just so everybody can hear it, and for the recording as well. So I'm going to leave out the flaky part just because I don't know if they're in the audience, and I love my wee thing scale. And it goes to health fault, so it's already flaky, right? So, so the question was, what Paula was asking was, when we start sending all this data into the system, do doctors really want to see it? And I want to add a little bit to it, which is, the example that he gave was that there's a lot of home medical devices. You can walk into Walgreens and buy a tremendous amount of them today. You can certainly buy a lot of them over the internet. What does this mean when all that data is coming into the doctor, and how do we have a quality? Because right now, the assumption that was presented was doctors don't want to see this because they don't know about the quality. The data could be flaky or otherwise. So I want to open this up to everybody and talk about how do you, when you start getting data from multiple sources, whether you are the source of the flaky data or you have to deal with the flaky data, how does that kind of affect your workflows and kind of clinical quality? Good question. Thank you, by the way.
I can start that one maybe. I think we're starting by doing a lot of work in the clinical validation to show that our images are just as good as the more expensive conventional video otoscopes, digital otoscopes that doctors sometimes use in their office, and collecting enough images to be able to make that claim reliably. But we're also allowing the doctor to say if it's an opt-in system, right? If they want to take this data, they want to interact with the patient in that way, they can. And if they get an image in that they don't feel is good enough, then they can have the patient come in and actually see it in person. So it's not complete reliance on these images. It's a way to provide them with the information which, if they feel it's sufficient, they can make that diagnosis. But if they don't, they can still have the patient come in person.
Yeah, I would just chime in and agree on the same thing. It has to be built as an opt-in from our primary customer, which is the doctor, right? And if you can create a fluid marketplace for this data flowing into doctors where they can pick and choose what they want to use and how, I mean, at some point you get to the point where the doctor says, I want you to use Eric's product instead of whatever else is out there in the marketplace because I know that the quality is good. And if your doctor tells you to use that, that's probably the one you're going to use. So I think it's about putting them in control.
I want everyone to hear your accent. There you go. It's now.
Yes, there's an Aussie in the house. So self-proclaimed. So yeah, I was just, in addition to this, is that this is a really important question about, like, what are you making, you need to think of the risks for the clinicians that you're serving and providing this data to. And in our case, suicidality and self-harm, there could be a case that clinician could have potentially had access to that data, and if they did, they were liable and should have acted upon it. And so the way we've got around that is that they can only access that data when the patient's with them in session, and the patient has a code that they sort of give the clinician, and they can access it then, because it is relevant and the clinician needs to see it and we need to collect it. But yeah, we're censoring to protect the clinicians in that case. So there's all sorts of opt-in scenarios that you can have.
So I'd really like Jeff to chime in here, because I think this clinical decision making and the use of data and the process is an area where Jeff and his background in particular is a lot to add.
Sure. So I'm Jeff Tangney. I'm CEO, founder of Doximity. We're the largest, fastest growing professional network for doctors. We're at 68,000 U.S. physicians, adding about 2,000 a week. And I think we're living testament to the fact that doctors do want to communicate. Today, it's mainly fax machines, right? There are 15 billion fax pages sent in the U.S. healthcare system each year. It's the only secure way to get your lab report from point A to point B. And I actually agree with some of the skepticism about inclusion of patient-generated data. There's a lot of cut-and-paste medicine going on right now within EHRs, right? From a doctor's point of view, it's great that I have a 40-page record, but I have an 8-minute visit. So something's got to give, and yet there still needs to be that discussion that I can have with colleagues. One of my favorite jokes, one of our pilot sites has been Brigham and Women's Hospital, which has great technology systems. It's right across the street from another Harvard hospital. And the joke there is that the easiest way to get a lab report from one to the other is by paper airplane. And it's true. The other way is you find the fax number, of the person who, is in the neurology department over at, Brigham and Women's, and try to find some way to navigate it to them. So at Doximity today, we're doing about 10,000 secure messages a day between doctors. They're using it to more easily manage their referrals. I'm actually not that optimistic that, we all talk about our healthcare system here in the United States. It's not a healthcare system, it's a healthcare market. And in a healthcare market, you're going to have different players who will own, their patient data, their EHRs. And, prior to doing this, I was a co-founder, COO, and president at Hippocrates for 10 years. Sorry, I should have mentioned that as part of my serial number.
That's all right.
And so I remember being on a panel in 2000, 2001 talking about, clinical integration and how this was going to happen. And, my general view is that it's not a technology limitation at this point. I mean, there's lots of standards discussions that have been going on, ad infinitum. It's a business discussion. At the end of the day, I spend a lot of time putting together this, patient, let's call it customer record, and sharing that with, competitors is not the top priority of your average hospital CIO. But it is a top priority of the physicians and the frontline caregivers that are seeing those patients, because there's that individual empathy and, frankly, the ever-looming risk of medical malpractice liability. So I'm actually very optimistic about the cloud and what some of the companies on this panel are doing to empower the individual, to empower the doctor, the nurse, the NP, the PA to more quickly reach out to that hospital that may be in a different system, but still has your lab report, and allow that to be shared more easily. And again, that's one of the things we're seeing day to day on our network. And I think our growth, going from 0 to 11% of physicians in about 15 months speaks to that need.
So there's a lot of really fascinating follow-up things in there, and I'll get your question in one second. I think that one of the things I want the panel to also focus on as we pass through the first 20 minutes is there's technical integration, right? And I think it's very easy for us to conceptualize, but there's a lot of workflow integration about the roles of the individual nurses and doctors and care coordinators and other people. And so I certainly will ask the panel in general to start to weave into the questions and some of the answers, some of the things they see that even if they can overcome the technical hurdles, which suffer the same lack of alignment that the rest of the healthcare market, I'm going to start saying that, that's excellent, by the way, the market has. What about some of the workflow issues to actually get to scale and adoption? So I want to make sure we get your question, though.
Thanks. So we've been looking at investing in these sorts of things for quite some time. And one of the biggest issues for us to understand, and Eric would be a good poster child for this, is the regulatory pathway. So when you're sending information for a doctor to make a diagnostic decision, what exactly is the regulatory oversight on that sort of thing? What can you claim? What can't you claim? What do you understand about the pathway, and what don't you understand about the pathway?
So I'm just going to repeat the question. The question is about the regulatory pathway, and really you're talking about moving from either a non-regulated device or a Class 1 device up to a Class 2 device that's going to be used in kind of a clinical decision-making process. Certainly something that my last company had to worry about quite a bit. And we'll start with Eric down there, and I think this is a good one also to make sure, Sean, that you're involved with answering as well in terms of the clinical decision-making process when you move from, start moving data into the system.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the real kind of threshold for us is that it's still the doctor or the relevant medical person making the decision, making the diagnosis. And so all that we're trying to claim with our devices is that it basically you can convert your phone into an otoscope or a dermoscope. You can convert it into the same as the predicate device, not that it's making any diagnosis.
Do you need FDA approval?
At the same level as the predicate devices, and so otoscopes in general are Class 1 510K exempt.
What data do you have to give them to get that approval?
For the otoscope, there's no 510K associated, so there's no approval necessary. We have to have good manufacturing practices and quality systems, but there's no pre-market approval necessary.
It's notification.
Yeah.
So you just have to give them the notification that from Class 1. Because the
Just batch data?
Yeah, the diagnosis is not happening on the device itself. So the capture is the same as the doctor looking. So the operation has to be exactly the same. It's just snapshotting it. So the conclusion is the same. But it's not making an indication. It's not deciding for the doctor. The doctor still has to make a decision again.
We certainly found in our products, we were doing the same thing with glucose meter, a bunch of Class 2 regulated devices and being used in congestive heart failure and other high-end chronic disease states with both high costs and high clinical issues, that it was basically every FDA audit was basically show me that you can prove what comes off the device is what comes into the device, show me that it wasn't tampered with in fashion, whether tampering meant either security or you just screwed it off. A great example of that is every glucose meter, including every single one from LifeScan, transmits the data differently. If you use the same parser for everything, you're going to get either 7 milligrams or 7,000 milligrams, depending on which way you shift that decimal point. So a lot of it is the in and out piece, exactly as it was described there. But Sean, I want to make sure we get you involved in that question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of regulation, our product kind of goes around it, and nothing we're doing is FDA regulated. So I'm Sean. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Omada Health. We built a web program for people with prediabetes to help reduce the risk they convert to type 2. So in terms of the data that we're collecting from our participants in our program, it's really, because they're in the pre-diabetic category, it's really weight data. So we built a web translation of this original clinical trial that was shown to be very effective in avoiding the risk of conversion. And it's thus far we have no indications that we would fall even close to the gray area of FDA regulation. Now that being said, the platform that we've created could be used for other indications, and I think kind of the FDA regulatory risks increase quite a bit if we create, say, a CHF product or something where the actual data from our scale that we're using results in a decision that the clinician would make that has a direct implication on the care being delivered.
Well, that and claims. When you guys sell this, do you make any claims that are medical, patient-oriented claims, or you just sell it as you can take pictures with this?
So the question was, what about claims? If you're not familiar with the FDA process, really what the FDA cares about is, what are the claims you're making in the market? If you say you cure cancer, you better prove it. If you claim that you do, whatever it is that you claim, how do you actually prove that those things are? Just so everybody understands what claims are and the question. So why don't we go kind of through the panel? How did you evaluate what your claims were and how they might fit into an FDA regulation?
So our devices are not on the market yet, but that is an important point. So we're not, as we're preparing to take them to market, we're being careful to structure our claims to not overclaim that we're not making a diagnosis. The device is not doing that. We're taking the pictures and enabling the transmission of the pictures.
EHRs aren't regulated right now. I'm wary of even saying too much about it, but the balance is against regulation stifling innovation versus it being important data that's moving through.
Yeah, for us, we just need to show reasonable evidence that we can hit DPP similar weight loss outcomes using our online program. And it's not, we wouldn't go out there and claim that, we're gonna have the exact same risk reduction in the conversion at 3 years to type 2 diabetes. But we'd go out there and say, look, we have this weight loss data based on kind of the things we've been doing right now. It's not in an FDA regulated place. Let's give it a try.
So as we move up past the FDA issue, and I certainly invite you to ask questions and come back to that if you like. One thing I certainly want to encourage the entrepreneurs in the audience is that a 510K, even a class 2, is not that hard. There's a lot of talk right now about whether the FDA is stifling innovation, and that's certainly outside the scope of our panel. But having done a number of those, I think that we're doing the market a disservice claiming that that's what's there, and we're scaring a lot of people from the space when actually doing a 510K, most of it is just good business and a good way to run your business. So I certainly would encourage you not to be afraid of it. However, let's switch gears for a second, because there was a great quote a few minutes ago that Jeff said, and as you might have seen when I tweeted begging you all to come here, that, and it was begging, I'll totally admit it, that the gloves were going to come off, that we're going to try to get deeper into some of those issues. So I want to give Paul a chance to respond, but there was 2 great quotes about cut and paste care, and I've got 8 minutes, but there's a 40-page report. So we'll generalize it a little bit, so it's not so specific. Otherwise, Sean would have to move, and these guys would just wrestle. Which is, how do you synthesize all the data that comes in to actually enhance decision support and clinical decision making, and what does it actually look like when you start talking about, I've got 8 minutes to visit, cut and paste care, and a 40-page report. This is a really interesting topic. Dumping a bunch of data into the system doesn't actually improve the system very much. So, gentlemen, lace them up. Let's have at it.
Paul's not cut and paste. He's more screenshots.
Oh, right. This is great.
It's different.
This is
I guess this is the 4th industry and maybe the 7th or 8th product that I've sort of digitally disrupted, if you will. And innovation always starts with the simple things, right? And so I'll go back to Amazon, right? I'll go to my consumer web roots, and I'll say in the beginning, everybody thought, oh, cool, you can buy a book. You don't have to be there in person. Potentially embarrassing books, maybe you don't need to stand across somebody at the cash register for. Then they figured out that instead of 300 books in a bookstore, there were 30,000 in the catalog. Then they figured out that they could get reviews on every single book. Then they figured out the reviews can be contextual, and you could be getting reviews from people that were closely related to you. And eventually, Amazon could just make recommendations and say people that like this book could read that book too. That didn't happen overnight, right? And I'd say EHR is still in the early phase of this, right? We're substituting for paper today. That's the beginning of the innovation and disruption cycle. At some point soon, I hope that the doctors are saying, hey, if I'm not using an EHR, my business is losing out because it does so many great things that are way better than paper ever was.
Charting and EHRs are good, particularly when it comes to gathering quantitative data and plotting that out over time. EHRs are good, particularly when it comes to plotting patient data over time and tracking notes in a systematic, complete way. So I don't mean to come across as saying that isn't good, but there's a lot of that layer that happens on top of that. Let's face it, how do we communicate with each other? It's email, it's text message, and a lot of times they're just very short little messages that have short replies. As I mentioned earlier, we have about 10,000 secure messages a day. Over a third of our doctors are active in any given month, so it's more than just this LinkedIn-style professional network. It's a lot of bouncing back and forth about a patient. We're not actually able to read those messages because they are encrypted end to end. We've asked our doctors for a sampling of them. We actually did go through and for a while just track how long were they on average. They tended to be about 120 characters. I mean, most of them are just these short, almost text-style messages about did this patient have, this type of LFT level when they were admitted last night. It's those types of quick questions that go back and forth. Imagine doing our jobs today without email, and that's what it's like to be a doctor, right? You can't, unless you're dealing within a system or within an EHR, which isn't designed for messaging, the way that you can legally communicate, and there's all sorts of HIPAA fines. The state of California has realized this is a profit center. There's $2.2 million in HIPAA fines in the state of California last year. And that will grow because they're fairly easy to find. And today, there's still a lot that's happening over insecure channels. So I think there's room for both. You need to have the full patient record, and then on top of that, you ideally have sort of the wall of messages about that patient, or just at very least a quick email back and forth that lives on top of it. CRM systems didn't get rid of corporate email. I wouldn't expect that EHRs are going to get rid of medical communication.
I hope whoever is tweeting this could keep up with that, because there's like 7 really great tweetable sentences in that answer. I mean, that was amazing. So, and you tweet with an accent, so it probably takes a little longer. So, so there are 2 questions in the audience, and I'm going to bring the mic down so people can hear you, because I just want to make sure that people get to hear your voices. But in the meantime, while I'm bringing the mic down, I want to guess what kind of books Paul is buying that he doesn't want people to know what they are at the bookstore. That was the most interesting thing for me, that Amazon for you is to hide what you buy.
Oh, yeah. That was a reference. I lived in Seattle when Amazon was taking off, and I don't think they'll ever say out loud what started their business so profitably.
So my question is more on how HIPAA and the FDA affects the transmission of patient adherence data and those sorts of actual patient usage and compliance and adherence data, both sorts of things.
Great. So HIPAA and FDA?
I'll go ahead first. There's privacy and security. Security isn't any different than what we see in the financial industry. It's encrypting messages end to end so they can't be sniffed very easily. If you go onto YouTube, you'll see there are a couple great videos that can show you with less than $50 in materials, you can actually set up and sniff every message going back and forth on most hospital pager networks. And they've done this, and of course now hospitals are trying to encrypt these pagers, but they're 50-year-old technology. So just encrypting it end to end is a key thing. And then the other key thing, and EHRs do this, Practice Fusion does this, we do this, is authenticating each person, that they are who they say they are. It takes us about a week to verify each of our physicians. It's a 3-step process. It does take a bit of work on their end. But then once they get in, they know that when they send a message to Dr. So-and-so, it is Dr. So-and-so, not someone posing as Dr. So-and-so. And that's critical from a security perspective. Also, just to mention it, this is about integration. We do have 7 API apps out now at Doximity, so we are opening that up. For those building new apps, if you want to let a physician come in, we have UCSF has an app for their medical alumni. Stanford has an app, Penn, so we have 3 of the top 5 medical schools who have effectively brought their medical alumni networks onto Doximity as Doximity groups and apps. We've had a couple partnerships with on-call scheduling apps. So I need to schedule who's in the OR next. It's actually a pretty hard problem right now. But just having the ability to have an authenticated doctor and a secure message go back and forth that, this surgery is running an hour late, you can come an hour late, is helpful. And we want to do more. And in this particular audience and space, I know we've been approached by a few firms who just want an easy way of verifying that so-and-so is a cardiologist and then having a quick view of their profile, their awards, their medical training, and we have all of that and can provide that through APIs. So folks who are interested, you can email me, Jeff at Doximity, or check out our developer site. It's developer.doximity.com.
Just want to really just quickly touch on HIPAA, just from the perspective as an entrepreneur who had to recently abide by all federal and state privacy laws around privacy policies and security. It's the sort of thing that because of what we're doing, we fall in a gray enough zone that we should be considered to be actually a care provider, so a HIPAA covered delivery entity. And it's really not that painful. It's sort of like the privacy side, it's mostly policies. And a lot of these are common sense things like, do you have a procedure in place if data's leaked, right? Do you have a procedure in place if someone is to complain about a privacy violation? It's those sorts of things that you can really work to get in place with your organization relatively quickly and easily. And from the security side, it's a lot of the stuff that Jeff mentioned. It's like, if you're not transmitting any data, a lot of times these security policies don't even kick in. And when they do, very often it's kind of simple stuff like making sure things are encrypted. So it hasn't been that much of a burden on our organization, actually.
And the policies, they have these online video training now about HIPAA
Yeah.
that you can personalize for your company. It's a very fun hour-long, training for every
gotta make sure
employee.
yeah, exactly,
It's fun, but a lot of you're right, it's policy-driven.
How many people have actually done HIPAA training or been through HIPAA training? And how many of you, keep your hands up, how many of you found that to be fun? Okay, so
What's
you,
an hour
one
there?
person with your hands up, Jeff would like to hire you.
Yeah.
So there's one more question, and then I know there's a question that came up over here too. So after you ask your question, you could just hand her the mic, please. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. This question is for Jeff and Paul. Jeff, there's a lot of messages now we're going to kind of get passed around. It's almost, in a way, it's a secure offline for doctors. At what point does that become part of a patient's medical record? And at what point will you actually then transition those messages over to Paul so the full body of somebody's knowledge of medicine is captured? And then second question, which is completely different. Paul, when are you guys at what point is video going to start being stored? So telehealth and those types of things. A lot of EHRs are holding their hands tight on that door just simply because I think the data requirements and those types of things. So you don't have to speak to it right away, but at some point, if you could work that into an answer, that would be awesome.
Maybe the word roadmap would be great. You could add that.
I'm kidding.
With months, yeah. As far as getting into the EHR, we do have a signed deal with Stanford to have an API into their EHR for this messaging. Sorry. We do have a signed deal with Stanford to be in their EHR. It's our first pilot case for a messaging protocol. Referring physicians are a big problem for hospitals. They, in the case of Stanford, they get referrals from all around the country, and being able to follow up quickly with the primary care physicians who referred them in is a hassle. They have a whole department on physician relations that is Googling, doctors to try to find their phone numbers and call them. We allow them to do that more easily. As far as having the messages be attached to that patient's record, we're a ways away from that. I think you'd need to add in, the medical record number of the patient to each thread, and there's a certain amount of, to the points made earlier, doctors liking some of the messages being outside the EHR. So, from our point of view, we're serving our doctors, and it's not easy to get into their EHRs, nor it may not be the top thing on their minds to have this attached to their records. But the quick messaging from the EHR out, I think, is the API that we're going to see more traction on soon. And we are excited to, this is looking out 5-10 years now, but I think there will be a point in time where instead of having all of these, silos of data about you as a patient out in all these places, there will be, in effect, that PHR that lives in the cloud, maybe on Paul's site, where then doctors can have messages that live on top of that, but it's sort of your patient wall. And we're working hard to provide just the messaging layer of that between the doctors now. We're not going to do the EHR part of it, but I think at some point the two will come together. It's a bit hopeful right now, but it will happen.
I guess on our end, both universes are real. They're both needed too. We are starting to work on messaging, but we're at the tip of the iceberg. So like a month ago, give or take, we allowed 2 Practice Fusion doctors to send a message to each other. That's not an email, so they're protected from a HIPAA point of view. They're not going to be a profit center for California. to Jeff's point.
My favorite quote. That was fantastic.
Yeah, that was pretty great.
That was good.
Next step is sharing charts. Next step beyond that, you can envision a day when they're collaborating on charts, right? We don't even have the sharing charts part done yet, and honestly, we're so focused on market share right now that these other pieces we're getting in when we can. I can't say that we've got that solved yet. We know that it's out there, and there's a lot of interesting problems around it. The one that you mentioned is one of them for sure. But we'll get there, and we're chewing it up.
Okay, so we've got the microphone down here. Next question, and then if you could give it to Simon, and then there's one in the back. Great, thank you.
Hello, is it on?
Yeah.
You probably already attached the things that what I was going to ask is when you see the near future of different, the EHR system can talk to each other, not only the physicians would be able to share patients' information, and much easier for patients to communicate with each other. Nowadays, in my practice, is a sort of nightmare to log in different security systems from UCSF, from Stanford, from private practice, for the institution who already had an electronic medical system, but it's still very cumbersome for physicians to communicate that way. Even within our own system, Northern California and Southern California, our electronic system does not talk to each other.
Sounds like an epic problem.
Yes.
Who wants to start with that? Anybody?
We can jump in anywhere. It is a nightmare landscape. I'll say that. But being a consumer web guy, I like big monolithic data centers that live in either in the cloud or in a cage somewhere. I have a financial services background, and we don't mind cages either. But it's not the environment that I've seen in healthcare world. I've only been in healthcare for a year, but I've seen a different data structure for every implementation of the same company's software, which is just mind-boggling to me. So yeah, it's a difficult problem.
So just to build on Paul's affinity for cages.
Now we understand what the books were, though, don't we?
I think we do. We're painting a picture here. Interoperability. I mean, we've been talking about this for decades, and I guess my quick comment on it would be, the word standards is used normally the main scapegoat, the main reason why it's so difficult for all of this to work. And I would say our primary challenges towards true interoperability are not technological in nature. They are business oriented in nature. And unless you see a complete sea change of the way the healthcare marketplace works, it's going to remain a problem. And so that's where, again, I have hope, I have excitement for the power, the empathy, the accountability of individuals and their ability to communicate in a way outside the systems that are in the buildings that they're working in. Not if I lose. I mean, you want to know one of the hottest growing businesses right now in hospital IT? Leakage tracking. I can track at a physician level based on claims data. We don't do this, but there are companies out there who do, which physicians are leaking patients outside your hospital to another system or another hospital. And that's something that, again, from a hospital CIO perspective, is very important. Want to make it easier to stay in network, in system, in building.
And sorry.
This is a bit. Well, I'm a big believer in free agent nation, Daniel Pink, the notion that smart people in an information age making decisions will work together better on their individual merits instead of organized into lots of hierarchies. We just added Konstantin Grinko, who was the second founder of LinkedIn, to our board, and that was one of their passions in building LinkedIn. If you look at what it's done to journalism and Hollywood and to industries that really have become more free agent oriented, the efficiency gains there are tremendous. Healthcare is actually heading the opposite direction. We're moving from having been a cottage industry of experts maybe 20, 30 years ago to being a feudal system, run by, particularly here in the Bay Area we see this, but large systems that have gobbled up a lot of the various practices, and I can almost just see the castles, if you will, in the territory. It's about territorial dominance. So that you need to be one of the plans or one of the systems that's offered by an employer, in this particular area. I think that's unfortunate. I'm not certain that that will serve the needs of the empowered patient as much as perhaps it should. And again, this is why I'm hopeful that the cloud and individual empowerment will take us more towards a free agent nation future of healthcare and not a sclerotic system.
Simon, I believe you have the mic. So what we're going to do is you have you, and then there was a question in the back. You've been waiting patiently. I want to introduce another topic, and we have plenty of time still to get through the questions, but I want to have a couple more topics out there, and we'll make sure the mic keeps moving around. So we'll keep one down there. Go ahead, Simon.
Thank you. So I'm hearing and seeing two different things. One is everyone wants to integrate, and we also have this explosion of digital health companies and entrepreneurs, and everyone's saying we're going to integrate, and we're not really going there. And I'm also hearing that we were thinking about this a decade ago. So what are the actual market drivers? Because even, we're saying this has become more and more like a free market in a way, in some ways, and yet there are clearly, for all the reasons you just mentioned, other forces on the hospital level and the plan level. But what are the actual key drivers that are going to make integration actually happen in digital health?
I personally think one of the biggest trends right now in overall healthcare is the move towards defined contribution or high deductible plans that will move more of us into this situation of, if you look at it, in the 90s, one of the biggest changes in the healthcare industry was the growth of 2 and 3 and now 4-tier copays in the PBM industry, in the pharmacy benefits. That really changed the way people made decisions about what drugs they had. What the insurers learned was saying no to someone, saying no, you can't have Lipitor, but you can have Zocor, is very difficult. That will lead to a lot of back and forth with that patient about why they need drug A instead of drug B. If instead you just say it'll cost you $50 a month to have Lipitor, you'll find that you get much better changing cost behavior without all of the back and forth. So we're going to see more of that kind of cost shifting happen to the patient, and that means patients will become more empowered, and there's a whole industry of companies that I'm excited about that will help consumers make better decisions about it, and then I also hope bring about more of this free marketplace of expertise in treating what I have.
The other thing that I would add is just the digitization of health data. I always say you can't do linear regression on a stack of manila folders, right? Linear regression is a 50-year-old tool for most industries. So just getting this digital data into a place where we can apply modern tools to it, I think is a big piece of driving the innovation puzzle.
So the mic's back there. I do want to say one thing. There was a brief Daniel Pink reference, which was awesome. And if I was Oprah, I would tell you all have a copy of Drive under your seats, but you don't. So, that would have been epic. No, sorry for saying that word. But that would have been fantastic. But certainly somebody worth checking out if you don't know Daniel Pink or his work. So the questions in the back here?
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a comment actually from the doximetry and the issue of messaging and EHR integration. I'm a part-time clinician at the VA medical system. Mm-hmm. And I know the VA counts as a totally different world, and so it probably doesn't have a lot of bearing. But I do think it's useful occasionally to look at what the VA has done in terms of their interventions to try and, because it's motivated some of my own entrepreneurial efforts. So one thing we've done around secure messaging is incentivized physicians to participate and get their patients engaged in secure messaging. So I am paid a bonus that's not insignificant as a government employee to do that, to make sure my patients are enrolled. And they give me the directions, which is terrific. And it's part of an EHR pop-up. So when I'm checking somebody out, it says, have you enrolled them in secure messaging? And if I do, that click counts as, which I do see at the end of the year. Number 2 is that with secure messaging, each secure message I communicate with the patient. The language is so much more informal. It's like, roger that, and, you use all these sorts of slang terms to try and get your patient to email with you more comfortably. And my guys are much, they're not traditional emailers. They're emailing me from a library, so they're much more formal, and I try and sort of make it more informal. At the end of each message, I can say, do you want to copy this to a medical record or not? Which is a great feature, because not that I'm worried about it, because everything is stored. Trust me, it's not like for medical malpractice they'll get me, but it's also because it allows me to curate and be very careful about not just adding more data, right? So everyone's very clear that some of these emails can be wasted and deleted and not included, but some, if a patient really reports important content, I can copy that into the medical record and give it a new heading. Anyway, the point is that I think sometimes we talk to ourselves so much that we lose sight of some of the innovations that's happening in places where the VA has 500,000 patients online right now that we're all communicating with using secure messaging. And, so I would just, I guess it's not a question, but it's a comment about our world, that there's lots of things happening around digital health that I think we can learn from that are exciting.
Yeah. So I just want to add to that. So the VA, I will be very honest, the VA made my business. The VA, people don't appreciate, oh, there you go. I thought it was just loud enough, but people don't appreciate, I think, how much goes on. And having integrated into Vista and the medical record system, it is amazing. I mean, people, I think, a lot of times think about the VA and governments in general as their perception is totally wrong when it comes to that healthcare system and what they have to do to be successful. So I certainly would echo everything you said. I will admit the level of HL7 support, the pipe and hat version from the 50s, is horrendous, but there are parts of Vista I'm happy I don't have to deal with anymore. But overall, that system and the care coordination model and the secure messaging, having worked with that directly is top notch compared to, we tend to think about huge academic medical centers as the forerunners, but what the VA has to do and the number of people they have to do, and if you think about the burden that the VA has, having, how many years of war have we been in? Think about the burden that the VA has in terms of their population. They are not worried about engagement. This is not an issue where they are trying to figure out where their patients come from. We have created that based on our foreign policy. And so it's independent of where you stand on that issue, the burden that's coming there is just amazing, and the way they've dealt with it's amazing. So I certainly applaud that and what you do specifically, so because it's quite an amazing organization. So one of the things I want to do, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeff. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to quickly join in the VA love. We worked with VA at Hippocrates and a few VISNs, and what's great about the VA is that they're not a commercial entity that's trying to keep all their patients in-house. That's why things like the Blue Button Initiative work, and in a way shame the rest of the industry to say, look, this isn't so hard, which is terrific. The other thing I'd add about being able to copy back to the medical record, one of the first feature requests we had on secure messaging was the ability to CC any message to my fax line, unfortunately, to the fax line for my EHR. That's our integration today. I CC the fax line, and so that way I can send a secure message, but I can copy it basically into my medical record, although it's still coming in as a fax somewhere and someone's having to then attach it to the right patient. But that's how we're doing it today.
Interestingly enough, too, is as we work with primary care providers and delivery organizations, the kind of number one strategy that we've got to get reports of the person's progress through our program back to the doctor, should they want them, is actually fax. It's a sad truth. It's way easier for us to just send a PDF fax to the input, the medical record input at the medical center, and then have somebody else digitize it. So it's like, that's our API, our magic API for getting information back, the fax machine.
developer.amadahealth.com/fax.
Exactly.
There's a fax number there. So I want to, one of the things I mentioned is I want to switch the topic a little bit just to get some more questions. I know there are a couple more out here, and we will come back to them. I've spent about 11 months since I've seen you, actually. And last time I saw you, you had a huge smile on your face because you're coming off a big fundraising, right? You're very successful. And it wouldn't be a digital health panel if we didn't discuss, dear Lord, how do I get funding? And so, and all of you have nice stories to tell. It's good that we are where we are. It's a good panel because I don't know if you understand, these guys represent some of the most successful organizations out there in terms of fundraising and success. So talk about how clinical integration and traction affected you in your fundraising cycles and in how the market saw you, because traction and getting patients or doctors or people in the system, how did the fundraising cycle, how did that integration approach affect you in your fundraising cycle?
I'll start. So we are still very early in the deployment. We've got a few doctors using it, but it's fairly informal. We've got a pilot going right now. We actually got a grant from the FDA as part of a pediatric device consortium at Emory and Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And that's probably our main traction validation point is getting that to we've got doctors using it right now, where they're taking the images, they're comparing it to their standard video otoscopes, and having that external validation from the FDA to give us some funding for that was helpful. But then also having some early feedback from other doctors who are starting to use it has been really useful. And we did just raise some funding. It was from Coastal Ventures, and we are hiring. So if you know any great developers, send them my way. It was, I think, for a long time we had a hard time either telling the story or saying it in the right way. But it was, we would talk to IT people who were scared by the medical device part. We would talk to medical device people who were scared by the IT part. And I think because we're starting to see more examples of this sort of thing, I think it's become less of a foreign concept. But having some validation of people starting to use it and getting some grant funding, I think did help us to show that people were interested, even if not everybody quite knew what it was.
Sean, Paul, Jeff, other fundraising stories about how that affected you?
We're really boring. We're typical VC funded. I think there were other talks all on that. So.
I can talk about fundraising in the digital health world right now. And for us, what we've been aided by is this just awesome kind of national framework around diabetes prevention that's just spinning up, right? And so, on the ground, diabetes prevention initiatives are starting to be paid for by some of the leading insurance companies, and the CDC is really working to create standards around them. And so it's this nice framework to allow us to say, like, look, it's right now, we are an early company, and it's not like we're going to be like the nation's diabetes prevention program now, but it allows investors to see this evolving and see a way that we could get there. So we raised around a seed financing based off some good traction with some of the entities that are working to bring diabetes prevention to the nation, as well as just really early proof of concept prototypes. And for our seed stage right now, our two main goals are to prove even more convincingly that our product works, and then get some initial commercial deployments lined up. And checking both of those boxes has really helped catalyze some of the conversations that we're going into right now as we think about raising our next fundraising round.
I haven't been out fundraising lately. We raised a $10 million round about 15 months ago, so we've been heads down building against that. I can say that quietly, this other end of the table is setting some great comps for all of us. So that's good news. I don't know. I raised money in 99 and 2000, 2001. In total at Hippocrates, we raised $46 million in venture capital and then took $40 million in secondary for Goldman Sachs. So having been through those cycles, I can say that the market right now, from what I can tell, and again, I haven't been out there actively, is pretty good. It's not 2099. I was quoted as saying that in 2000, if you could fog a mirror, you could raise venture capital, which is what I and my physician friend did. We could fog a mirror. So it was about press releases, and it was about partnerships. Today it's very much about actual traction. What's your MAU percentage? What's your DAU ratio to MAU? What's your actual metrics on the product? And that's good. I think that's a healthier, saner environment. But overall, there's a lot of folks interested in health tech, which is great to see.
Having also raised money at that time, I will, and you know Steve very well. Steve held the mirror and I fogged it, so I totally understand that story exactly. So we have a question down here. I know we want to come back to your question as we went through some of the fundraising stuff. Go ahead, and then when you're done, please hand it to the gentleman next to you so he can ask his question.
I've been in this business about 30 years. Maybe some of you recognize my childhood documentation. And my wife's been in this business for probably 32 years in healthcare IT as well. She's involved in HR and standards and so on here. So watching this business, I heard somebody say, oh, this has been around for 10 years. It's been around for 30 years. Somehow trying to get electronic patient record, digitization, and so on. And I'm HL7? Do you respect HL7's efforts? Is that something that's going on mainstream and you guys are mavericks, or are you part of this same trend and movement here? Is this deja vu? There we go. Is it on? Okay. Anyway, so I'm projecting, hopefully without it. But the point here is that what's going on? Help me understand that this is really incremental progress and not just spinning wheels. And I'm maybe being a bit of a pessimist here, but I'm just trying to figure this out, because I want to invest in the promise here as well, not only as a patient, prospective patient and healthcare and consumer, but just because I've been invested in this industry for years and I want to see it work,
Well, I guess I want to at least address the spinning the wheels part, because I've only been in this business for a year, but when I moved into this space, and I was talking to one of our former board members and investor, Rebecca Lynn, and Ryan Howard, our CEO, and I was saying, why are you guys talking to me, right? I'm a consumer product and marketing guy, a consumer technology guy, and they said, we think that these same methods can be successful in this space and can move into this space. And we weren't sure when I started, honestly, but they were pretty confident. I was really uncertain, but I figured after 5-6 months trying, I'd know, right? So it turned out they were right. Adoption is different now than it's ever been before. So when I came in, beginning in 2011, after 20 years or however long it had been of EHRs being out there, there was maybe 7% market share that was using an EHR. By the end of 2011, that was north of 20%. It'll be, more than double that, say, a year from now. So I'd say adoption is at a historic level, and we're no longer spinning our wheels. And I talked earlier about not being able to do linear regression on a pile of manila folders. And the key here is getting, I think, enough market share and enough concentration to get critical mass, and being able to turn on some of the modern digital tools that I've been using in the consumer space for a while now, and setting those loose. And I think once we do set those loose, and once we have open networks, and once we can crowdsource all of the application of those tools to this space, there's going to be no turning back.
Right. I think one of the key issue here is to incentivize all this. And that's what is at the heart of the feudalism, because everybody's trying to hold on to and maintain a territory for their own. I saw this 30 years ago, and I'm still seeing it today. How do you break through that? We talked about feudalism here. How do you create an incentivism that gets everybody together on the same page?
So I'm going to totally break the moderator rules and answer a question. If I've been jumping up and down off the stage, at this point, what else could I?
And answer definitively too. There's no other.
Yeah, I'm going to say absolutely. So first of all, on the HL7 part of your question, I think HL7, one of the big challenges with HL7 is starting with the pipe and hat version of the 2X versions and then leading to the 3.0 versions where they started to embrace more XML and structured data. The clinical document formats and other things started to come into that space. And all of that is gobbledygook. It really doesn't matter, right? What really matters is the lack of incentives. Jeff and Paul and other people have already said it much more eloquently than I have, is that, so why do I want to share data? I mean, who really wants to share data? And I think where this starts, and I think where the curve is, not so much for the EHR adoption side, but for the empowered patient side, are things like the quantified self movement. Things like when apps, not the apps today, not the wonderful stories you read in mobile health news every day about there's 9 million gazillion apps in the App Store, but when apps start to truly get out there and we start empowering people's health based on the goals, it's going to be more of the demanding of it, right? I mean, you already see this of people saying, why can't I get my Fitbit data and my Lark data and my this data and my that data in one place and actually start to manage this better myself? I was actually showing, I think he's in the room still, a couple folks, Elliot's in the back of the room. I was showing them the data that I got out of Palo Alto Medical Foundation. I hadn't been to the doctor in like 12 years, so they ran a bunch of tests, and I got an email. I literally got an email back, and I click on the email that says, you have a very high chance of having a tumor. I got that in an email. And I just because no one ever believes me, I actually have the screenshot if you want to see it. So it's great. We've got all this data. They immediately figured out I might have a tumor. They weren't very good in how they told me about it. So no integration is actually going to fix that. That's about aligned incentives. So I feel like that empowered patient movement and about how we start caring, not just for ourselves, but for each other, I think that's going to have a big difference to caregiver. As we, I was speaking at the Boomer conference earlier this week, and as the empowered caregiver, the expectation of the person providing care for the Boomer generation, I think you're going to see a significant change. It's easy to quantify itself as a bunch of people who keep track of how much they pee, but that's actually going to be the incentives for how we start thinking of ourselves less as patients and more as people, especially with caregivers. This is my take, at least.
I want to kind of build on that as a non-expert in this space, but just something I've been thinking about a lot recently. Yeah, I mean, I know nothing about HL7 or really EMRs, but what's interesting to me too is like, so you look at like HIPAA policies, and it's mandated in HIPAA that as a patient you can get your full medical record, right? It's just like that level of policy hasn't met the digital world. Like, so it's I mean, it's not, to me, 5-10 years out, it doesn't seem unreasonable that HIPAA would rethink that a bit and say, well, look, you have to download, you have to offer patients in your system the ability to download their medical record because there's already the analog proxy for that, and that seems like a reasonable next step there. And once that happens, maybe there's an incentive for a clinical system to offer the ability to upload that download because they want to pull people in, and those transactions might happen. I mean, to me, it feels like without those sorts of policies, you're not going to have a lot of integration. I mean, yeah.
I'm not so sure, actually.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. All right, now we go.
Really, I'm a lot more believer in the disruptive technology cycle than the policy or a monolithic system, whether it be government or something else, coming in and telling us how to do it. And I think even left to its own sources, the incentives have been great to drive EHR adoption and to get that data into the digital space. But at this point, if my mission as a company is to empower doctors to save lives, then when a patient whose record is in my system checks into a hospital, why wouldn't I send that patient record to the hospital? And when the patient is discharged from the hospital, why would the hospital, whose mission is to make these patients healthy as well, why wouldn't they send the record back to me, right? And I think to the extent that we can keep that market open and keep the long tail active and engaged, the market will actually do a much better job disrupting and enabling that at a broad scale than regulation.
So one last thing I want to add, and I want to make sure we get to a bunch of more of the questions, and we are getting later in the afternoon. The finance market figured this out. And until my Nigerian doctor emails me and tries to get to my medical records, the finance market's much more interesting to hackers and security and other things like that than anybody else. So the finance market has figured this out. They figured out a lot of open standards. They figured out how to share data between things. I fire up my tax document with Intuit, and it just sucks in all the data all the time. So we're behind as a market, those things. But if they can figure it out with much different incentives, much different security threats than we have, there are a lot of analogs of places where we can follow. The incentives are, Wells Fargo isn't as interested in you going anywhere else either, but there are a lot of ways that great startups like Mint and other things, where are those mints of healthcare? Where are we demanding that the data gets open and returned to us so we can process it and analyze on its own? That wave hasn't hit healthcare yet, but as it does, I think we'll see significant change. So, but you have a question on here. Thanks for waiting. I apologize.
Just a couple of things. So, there's about 10 different things. One of the things that Jeff touched on that I think has an impact on everyone's decision. So, the ACO model that's proposed is taking us back to the HMO world, which most people don't see happening. Most of primary care is going to be lost as an independent organization. And with that, the EMRs that support the organizations are going to be forced on the acquired organizations. Cedars-Sinai bought 3,000 private physician practices last year, right? You've got Kaiser has 18 instances of Epic across 9 million members and the vast amount of the West Coast. You've got Sutter actively trying to do the same thing, and then similarly on the East Coast. And then you've got crazy things like Aetna's buying primary care physicians to push them in because everyone wants that ACO check. where they're going to, instead of having this loose collective of individuals, they're going to own all the pieces, so they can get one check and they can figure out how to spend it. And so I think from a digital health perspective, the question is, who do you pick to integrate with? I mean, my money's you're going to have 3 big boys or 4 big boys and Practice Fusion as the maverick outside, Freenomics, highly independent. Well, yeah, but I mean, seriously, you've got 750,000 physicians in the U.S., and there will probably be about 250 to 300,000 that remain highly independent as long as they can make malpractice insurance from a risk pool. And so how do you make those decisions? I mean, from a messaging standpoint, you're going to have to choose, can I layer on top of Epic? Because that may be the only game in town for half the country. How do I integrate from a interface issue? Do I have to beg Judy to let me in? How do you guys wrestle with the tectonic plate shift of our world's changing in terms of how do we get used and paid and participate in healthcare? Or do you just go straight outside and go straight to the consumer?
Who wants to start? Maverick, you want to start?
Honestly, I think you're ahead of the market, really. I think we're all about adoption today. Let's get everybody into the systems. Let's get them on the systems. Let's get the data in there. I agree it's coming, but it's not here yet. For me, my hope with my consumer background, again, is that we're patient-centric. What do patients need to get the best health? And if I'm a patient, like I say, and I check into the hospital, I don't care whose EMR I'm using. I want my medical record there in the hospital. And when I check back out, I want it back to my primary care doctor so that I don't get readmitted, And so I think that business models will align around it. I think they will be helped by, realignment of payment models and incentive models that are coming along. But to the extent that those can help it, I think it'll naturally want to happen as well.
I mean, I agree with most everything you said. Really, not a whole lot to add. We do work on so this pilot that we're doing at Stanford is built on Epic. Epic, the messaging doesn't work that well, and rather than having Cedars-Sinai have to go out and buy 3,000 practices at a loss. And by the way, there are all sorts of studies. I mean, this happened in the late 80s as well. Hospitals bought up primary care practices to capture referrals and found that they didn't capture as many referrals as they had hoped, A, and B, that the productivity of those practices goes down. They say that day one after a physician practice is bought by a hospital, they see 15% fewer patients. And then it's the next day and the next day. And it really just comes back to what your incentives are, and are you running your own small business, or are you working for a big health system? HIEs and P2P are worth mentioning. So P2P within Epic is becoming one of the main ways that, at least in the Bay Area here and a few other dense urban markets, that patient data is flowing from place to place. The thing that hospital administrators like about P2P, peer-to-peer, is that they can choose where the data flows and where it doesn't and how. So primary care to hospital, absolutely, that usually makes sense, right? And you Practice Fusion, I don't know what your percent primary care versus specialist is, but if you are largely primary care, then that does make a lot of sense. So you're definitely going to see, hospitals connecting with pediatricians in the East Bay and sharing data with them very nicely. I always think I have to smirk a little bit cynically when I see, Kaiser showing that, HIE isn't so difficult. We've created standards, and Kaiser is connected with Mayo Clinic. Well, why not connect with, Sutter across the street? And the answer is because that doesn't make as much business sense. So, it's happening, but it's across the country, and it's in these, stranger situations. Cali Connect here in California is the High-Tech Act-funded HIE, $40 million in grant. You see that in most other states. They've had state-level grants. They have a 24-member board, and by one board member's estimate to me, about 17 of them didn't want it to succeed. If you really boil it down, HIEs are a few years in now here struggling, and it comes back to, again, alignment of incentives. Interoperability is, again, not a technological problem, shouldn't be a technological problem in this day and age. It's mainly a commercial alignment of incentives problem.
I think, to represent the early stage kind of data producer side of it, like we're thinking of it maybe more like Paul's describing. I think the onus is on us to demonstrate that our data is useful, that people want to generate it, that people can use it, that it provides meaningful outcomes, and we're much more focused on that than how we're going to integrate it into various records. Because if we can show that it's useful, our assumption is that the records will then want to let us in because people will want to use that data, and so it's not spending all our time figuring out the technical challenges of getting into 5 different records, but how can we show that this is irresistible data, and if the data is irresistible, then they can't resist.
So we've got a question down here with the mic. Great.
Yes. This has been a very interesting panel, and I have to say there have been moments when it gets incredibly depressing just listening to some of where things are, but then there are some really great points, and just a couple little questions and comments. In response to the question that came up earlier about what would be different now than in the past, and I just wanted to hear a little bit about what you guys think of this. I have been in the clinical space for about 20 years, and I think one of the things that is different is maybe the appreciation of the the physicians for actually how important this is. And I think that is something that's very different now than it was 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, or 5 years ago. And I think that's, when you've talked about the Amazon comparison, I mean, when things were direct, the consumer was driving that. And the consumer was definitely, and they had an understanding of that language, and they knew it, and they could communicate back and forth and make it happen. Physicians have not had that. So we have been probably one of the groups the most far behind in IT, if not IT illiterate. I mean, there are times when a physician will call somebody to turn their computer back on in their office. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with as far as the level of understanding. So you can imagine whenever you don't even speak that same language, we don't even have an idea of how all this data can be used and what the possibilities are and how creative one can be to even design algorithms to use it, et cetera. So I'm coming back around, but the circular sort of thought that I had was that literally that's been what is missing. I do think that now the younger kids coming up, the physicians, actually do know how to speak this language a little bit better, and that may be one of the critical links. But in the meantime, it's very interesting that the consumers do speak the language. And so one of the ways around this may be exactly as you were discussing earlier with the fusion ideas, where the patients have control of their records and actually give physicians access to them. So we're not, the physicians in the hospitals aren't the ones that are actually controlling the records, but the patients are. And they give them, because then we get around all this stuff about having to worry about the liabilities, et cetera.
It's a great segue into where I wanted to spend kind of the last 10 minutes and some of the topics. But first, I want to tell you that when you started, you're like, it's been a great panel, and I got very happy, and then you're like, it's been very depressing, and then I got very sad. So maybe you should have told me about my tumor, because that would have clearly been, so. Absolutely, no. Well, honestly, though, and I mean it as a joke, but I actually think it's true that if we're a little depressing, that means we're probably being honest and factual. And I think it's kind of the panel's responsibility to do that. But I want to tee up part of your question and make sure we include everyone in this, because there's a way I want to think about this question. I hope it's okay. I'm going to morph it a little bit, which is the risk of digital health. As we sit in San Francisco and we had a conversation about HL7, the word XML came up and everything else, is to only focus on technology, right? And clinical integration, especially getting these products into a clinical setting, is a lot more than that. It's workflow, it's education, it's adoption, it's support. You can't just drop off a server or today say, go to this URL, and off people go. And so one of the ways I'd like to frame that question also is to talk about when you're onboarding physicians, doctors, nurses, care coordinators, what is the process of bringing people onto the system, and actually how do you support them long after the technology part of integration is complete? And I think that's something I'd like all of you to try to address, because I think it really hits for all of you.
Sure. So for us, that's, it's pretty early. Our system is not fully deployed in a variety of practices yet. We're still doing early pilots with physicians, but it's been just showing them the kind of simple workflow on how to input the images and how to work through the ancillary data that comes along with the images. I think that really, you're mentioning that we tend to focus too much on the technology rather than the integration. I think for us the focus is not just on the technology but also kind of what the problem is we're trying to solve, and that's a more interesting and more motivating thing for us. Is okay, so the problem we're trying to solve is the child wakes up crying at 2 a.m. and mom would alternatively take him to the emergency room right now, and if we can solve that problem, if we can make it so that she can instead take an image and send it to a doctor for diagnosis, then hopefully the integration gets easier, because now we have to figure out where to send that image, who's going to be that doctor on the back end, what that all is going to look like. But if we can meet that pain point, if we can actually provide an alternative to that difficult situation, then being able to analyze the image on the back end is the easy part.
To make an optimistic statement, because I'm afraid I'm sounding depressing. Physicians did miss out on the PC wave of the 80s. You don't have a desk. If you're a physician, you're going from room to room. And the reality is that you're going to miss out on some of that technology unless it meets your needs. And physicians are not Luddites when it comes to technology. I hate it when people say that, because, physicians are the smartest people in our society. Average GPA 3.7. It's easy to say that the rest of us know PC technology. I think it's hard to blame folks who don't have PCs and desks for not knowing that. But that's changed with mobile. So with the Palm Pilot in 1999, we got to over half of U.S. physicians on Hippocrates now. Much higher penetration among physicians than anywhere else now. iPads are getting up near 50% physicians. We were proud at Hippocrates. We were one of the 4 companies on stage when the App Store launched. And it's hard to believe that was less than 4 years ago. It was July of 2008 when the first apps were created for the iPhone. So just imagine how much progress in the last 4 years. And that technology is, I think, finally meeting the needs of physicians. It can stay in their pocket. It can go from room to room. It can do the things that the PC never could. So I'm excited that I think a lot of this new era we're seeing in health tech investment is gelling with physicians. 3/4 of our use at Doximity today is on iPhone and Android, mainly iPhone. We're on the web as well, but it's just so much easier to pull out your iPad and read and reply to a fax or a note, or to look up who the thumb surgeon in town is. So I think as mobile technology becomes more central to a lot of the technology development, I think it'll fit healthcare a lot better. And that will be an exciting, I think, next epoch for us.
I think for us, how we work with clinical delivery organizations and physicians has a really big downstream impact on our business. I think we want to be viewed as a replacement for the pamphlet that they now hand someone with prediabetes. And in order to do that effectively, we have to be incredibly thoughtful about how we work with the primary care provider and how we make sure that they feel like they're at the center of this, that when they're referring someone to our program, they have incredible visibility to the experience we'll be able to provide, that they have kind of ownership over that transaction, that they can get insight into what data they're getting back, and really be able to respond to the patient as we bring them kind of through that. And if we're able to create that relationship, it needs to be very, very trusting. So, we're developing a whole kind of suite of materials and communication pieces, and who knows, maybe there's even products that would go on the physician's iPad, so that when they refer someone, they can walk the person through what the Omada Health prevent program experience would be like. That would enable kind of a higher conversion there and a more trusting handoff. So it is really important, and it's not just a technology thing. In fact, it's not at all technology, really. It's as simple as we need to get the person's email address, and we can take it from there, but it's much more of an emotional kind of, how does this fit into your world and the way that you practice as a physician that we need to be thoughtful about.
I guess I'd like to join Jeff in saying physicians aren't Luddites. I'll also go back in my own history and say the same problem has been faced over and over, right? When we started doing online banking back in 1999, the web interfaces were complicated. They were hard to use. It was not a user problem, though. It was actually it was an industry problem. We were building interfaces that were too complicated. We were putting fields in input forms because that's what the back-end database wanted. We weren't yet experienced and kind of mature in our usability models. It was our problem, not the consumers. And I'd say we're just in the beginning of that adoption here, but it's not the doctor's problem. It's our problem. We're the ones who haven't yet figured out how to communicate or meet your needs. When we were trying to convert banking in, our gold standard when we were building new interfaces and new models was we'd call my mom up and we'd say, "Mom, log in. We're going to watch you try to use this system," right? Now, these processes have become a lot more mature than calling Paul's mom, which is good.
Very nice.
But we can actually accelerate that now. We can actually get going a lot faster. And so now we come into this industry, and for us, we're trying to bring doctors' offices out of paper and into digital space, right? And we're using the same tools that we use in online banking and everywhere else, and in moving people from getting their coupons in the newspaper to coupons.com, where I was before that. And so we're using scaled systems. We're using online tutorials. We're using YouTube videos. We're using all of the automated, scalable support methods that we've been using in other industries to try to hopefully convince you that it's not the doctors.
Can I just add one?
Please.
Yeah, please. One quick Paul Mom story.
No, it's okay.
I would
No,
not
no.
turn around and face the camera because we're going to put this on YouTube. People are going to know.
I got to work with an early EHR in the late 90s, and I remember going out and they had the computers on wheels in hospitals, the cows, and we were doing some training, and we had designed this really complicated interface, which of course only we understood, but I remember moving the mouse around and having one of the senior attendings there, looking at the mouse and seeing the mouse moving and then the pointer moving on the screen, and then grabs the mouse. It was like a Ouija board, moving around. Because if you've never used a PC, the mouse is a pretty exciting, weird, magical thing. But again, this was the age of PCs on desktops. Most physicians missed the first half decade of that because they don't have desks. And that's no one's fault. I think it's the industry's fault for not building computers that you can use while standing up, which is where we're at now.
So administratively, we are out of time. However, there's one ultra administrative thing I need to remind you of, which is there is a session after this. So yesterday when we came into these panel rooms, it was the end of the day, and we all slowly filtered out. There is actually, Kaufman is actually presenting a bunch of their information, and Dominique, I've got to say, has graciously put himself literally at the end of Saturday. And so please make sure to attend that and listen to what they have to say, because it's great. We have a 10-minute break between now and then. So I'm going to briefly summarize a couple of the key things we did, and I'm going to invite you to certainly come and ask more questions afterwards. I can't believe that we actually spent this much time and actually ran out of things to say. I know I talk a lot, but it's amazing how many great questions you guys had. So a couple of things that we touched on today that I think are really worth following up on is the whole idea of integration being both clinical and procedural, I think, is really important and needs more thought leadership between you and the rest of, not just the people on this panel, but the rest of the space is critically important. Figuring out the innovative business models. There's one other really interesting point that came up, and I say this over and over again, and I appreciate that the panel brought it up, which was business model innovation is as important as this space, if not more important, than any kind of technical innovation. And there are no barriers to business model innovation. Don't go blaming the FDA for lack of business model innovation. The third thing that we learned that was really important is do not shop for books with Paul. So, so with that, I want to thank everybody. Please give the panel a warm welcome. Thank you. These guys were great, and I'm sure they'll actually spend a little time during the break if you have further questions. So thank you very much for coming.